one of Alys's fascinations has been with the action, sometimes enormously protracted, that produces no identifiable result. In other words, that is action that is unproductive, that is maximum effort, minimum result. And one version of that from 1997 included in the exhibition is called The Paradox of Praxis, #1. It's the record of an action carried out under the rubric of sometimes making something leads to nothing. For more than 9 hours, Francis pushed a large block of ice through the streets of Mexico City until it was completely melted. On one level, this was, as Alÿs said, a settling accounts with minimalist sculpture. The block of ice strongly resembles the kind of generic minimalist object. It's rectangular. It's a block. It's in a way a specific object, as Donald Judd would have said. But like many artists of his generation who emerged as artists right after the peak period of minimalism, and I could cite the work of a number of other artists that could be discussed in that context, but Alÿs felt the need to literally work his way through the powerful legacy of this dominant art movement of the previous generation. And so for hour after hour, he pushed this block through the streets until finally it was reduced to no more than an ice cube, so small that he could casually kick it along the road until finally it melted away to nothing more than a wet stain on the sidewalk. Some of Francis's work deals with the interaction between being an outsider and an insider. Even though he's now lived and worked in the historic center of Mexico City for many years, when he first came there, he was a foreigner. He felt, in a way, an outsider, and he felt the need to find ways of interacting with this huge city in which he had never lived before. And when we think about some of his early works, that was made quite explicit. In Mexico, you will often see tradesmen standing with a placard advertising their services as a plumber, an electrician, so on. And Francis joined a group of those men to advertise his own services as a tourist. And he remained there waiting for someone to hire him in that role. No one ever did hire you, did they, Francis? Unfortunately, it was not successful. But it does suggest also a relationship between the tourist and the artist. The artist has always, the traditional, in a way, romantic version of the artist has always been someone who is on the outside, in some ways a bystander, an onlooker. And in some ways there, I think there's a connection between the role of the artist and the role of a tourist in a culture. And one of the great arcs of development in Francis's work since his arrival in Mexico City has been the transition from an outsider trying to find a place in that culture and the status he occupies now, where he feels more confident about speaking in a way from that culture and from the inside of it, I think. It's important to distinguish, one of the generative things in Francis's practice has been his habit of taking enormously long walks around the city, and there are a number of works in his oeuvre that are based on the idea of walking both as the idea of clearing the mind as a way of generating ideas without a rigid structure, and walking as a way of being open to things that happen by chance. But it's also important to distinguish this idea from the romantic 19th century Baudelairean idea of the artist as a flaneur. As Baudelaire put it, the spectator is a prince who everywhere rejoices in his incognito. For Francis, the flaneur is a very 19th century European figure. And it goes with a kind of romanticism that he doesn't see as having much place in a metropolis like Mexico City. Alÿs himself has had a trajectory in his work where he has tried to get beyond the inherent isolation of the flaneur, who deliberately holds himself aloof from the society. There's an element of in the flaneur that he is not only holding himself apart from the life of the city, but is perhaps holding himself above the life of the city and looking down on it. That is, despite all his many walks in the city, something that Francis has, I think, tried to avoid. He doesn't want to feel at home in the sense of the sophisticated so-called man of the world who feels at home everywhere, so much as he wants to be at home enough with his own role in specific settings to get to the point where he could potentially actually intervene and act within those specific settings. And one of the great movements in Francis's work over time has been the movement from actions and interventions that cast him totally in the role of the outsider or the observer to actions in which he is the instigator or the participant, the protagonist in the action. One of the works in which he became the protagonist is from 1997, a work that's included in, a kind of relic of this work is included in the exhibition called The Loop. There were a number of exhibitions in the 90s focused on the border between Mexico and the United States, which, as I'm sure you know, is a very politically fraught issue in the United States and often used for a kind of pseudo-populist politics. And the border between Tijuana and San Diego is one of the most heavily trafficked and politically contested border crossings in the world. For his contribution to the exhibition Insight, which was held in both San Diego and Tijuana, Francis proposed very simply to begin his journey in Tijuana and end it in San Diego. In other words, to do a crossing that's made tens of thousands of times every day with various political contexts attached to it. Alÿs made the journey, however, without crossing the border between Mexico and the United States. Instead, he embarked on a 5-week-long trip that did take him from Tijuana to San Diego, but only after passing through Mexico City, Panama City, Santiago, Auckland, Sydney, Singapore, Bangkok, Rangoon, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Seoul, Anchorage, Vancouver, and finally arriving in Los Angeles, circumnavigating the globe to arrive a mere 100 yards away from his starting point on the other side of the fence. It's a global version of a walk around the neighborhood. And again, maximum effort, minimum result. You can see in a work that's quite different in scale and media from, say, pushing a block of ice through the streets until it melts, but can still be seen under this rubric of maximum effort, minimum result. The journey was an enormously elaborate way of producing an absolutely minimal result, the transit between Tijuana and San Diego. Given the fraught nature of American debates over the immigration of undocumented Mexican and other Latin American workers to the United States, however, this piece inevitably took on a politically charged set of connotations. Although Francis himself made a point of not articulating any of these, they were nevertheless